We are, as you know, in the midst of a national conversation about criminal justice reform. There's even some bipartisan agreement. And in comes your proposal for sentencing reform. How do you see it fitting into this larger national conversation?
Well, it fits in this sense that it's part of a reaction to the 30-year prison building binge. Somewhere in the 70s, with increasing acceleration through the 80s and 90s, most of the states, many of the countries of the world, went on a lock-em-up binge. The increases in many places were as much as 500%, far exceeding, probably by 4 times what the crime rate increase was, or much less the population. It's a natural reaction to put back into the system some careful provisions that will incentivize better prisoner behavior. The long fixed sentence where there's no opportunity for rehabilitation, education, mental health treatment, drug treatment, that's a very benighted approach, which is now being reversed and supported by Republicans, conservatives, as well as Democrats and liberals.
And this, what you're proposing, would undo part of what you signed as governor the first time. And I'm wondering, when you signed it, what did you think you were solving? What problem were you solving?
I was aware that some of the sentences by the parole board, some of the decisions, came up with disparate results. So some would be kept a lot longer than others, and people were alleging racial disparities. There was also, I had started to try to put more certainty into the process. I thought clarity and certainty of prison time would operate as a deterrent. My sentencing measure was relatively modest, but right after it was signed, the legislature started increasing prison time. For example, murder 1 was 7 to life, then it went to 25 to life, then they added enhancements of 25 and even 40 years. So now you get sentences of 60 and 70 years, whereas before you had a tenth of that. There was an overreach. Sometimes when you have a problem, you overcorrect. And what happened here was not just that we switched from an indeterminate to a determinate sentence, but every year thereafter, the next 4 governors added things called enhancements. There are now 400 separate enhancements that can add up to 25 years, each one of them. And now you have over 5,000 separate criminal provisions. This is unheard of when you really compare the 10 commandments that have stayed at 10 for 2,700 years and the law of California, which is basically stable for 60 years. And then they went on kind of a motorized legislative rampage where you just got more and more time, more and more prisons, and the result was a greater threat to public safety because families were broken up, and when people came back, they had no rehabilitation, no skills, and were very disoriented.
You mentioned race, and that was one of the reasons you felt there was some racial disparity, so you thought bringing some certainty to it might eliminate that.
Yes.
What's your view of race in the criminal justice system?
Well, race is very much connected to life opportunities and economics. And so those at the bottom are predominantly people of color, and they're the people in our prisons. Now, there are some Caucasians, and there are some people that may be a bit middle class, but the vast majority of people locked up are poor, are black, are Latino, are Asian in certain cases. So, look, the idea, this is kind of a one-note system now. Time in a cell. Time in the cell. Now, what we need is a more sophisticated system of restorative justice, drug treatment, mental health treatment, supervision, electronic monitoring, different ways of restructuring the thinking and reintegrating the offender, because they all come back anyway. And when you put them in a cell and you give them no incentive for them to take charge of their lives by getting an earlier freedom date, then they join gangs, they use dope, they get into violence, and there's no way to control the prisons because there's no internal incentive. And what my measure does, it brings back the ability of a convict to say, okay, if I play by the rules, if I get out of the gang, I can actually get home earlier. And then you add to that, and if I take high school training, if I take vocational training, if I do college, if I do mental health, drug treatment, all that helps. So what we're doing is building a system of internal incentives to get people to be better citizens when they inevitably come back to society.
One of the other things this ballot measure would do is when juveniles are involved, it would take the decision whether to try them as adults or juveniles away from the prosecutors and give it to the judges. Why do you think that's important?
Because the job of a prosecutor is to prosecute, not judge. The job of a judge is to judge. And whether someone 14, 15, 16, or 17 should be tried in the juvenile court under that system or transferred to the adult court is primarily a judicial question. Let the judges decide.
You have appointed 300 or so judges in California. And one thing I've noticed is that you've appointed more people who were either public defenders or had defense attorney experience, much more so than any recent governor. Why? And how do you think that's going to change the calculation and recalibrate?
First of all, we never had a tradition that said to be a judge, you have to be a district attorney. That developed probably in the 90s. The judges are supposed to be independent. You want judges who have commercial background, you want judges who have prosecutorial background, but city attorney, you want a diversity. And I've tried to look at the merits, and I think most people would say that the quality of the bench and the judiciary is definitely very good in the numbers that I've appointed.
How concerned are you that the DA's association has already come out against this? Yeah. Crime victims groups will be against it. How concerned are you about this being, and you being, portrayed as soft on crime?
Well, that is the line. This is an old story. My father ran for Attorney General. His Republican opponent took out a full-page ad in the San Francisco Examiner with a hypodermic needle, trying to portray my father as the friend of dope dealers. And that was in the 50s. So, yeah, there will be campaigns, but I've been around a lot of campaigns, and I think people want fairness. They want public safety. So I think you're going to hear a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric. But the fact is that the provision that I'm proposing is essentially what we're already doing under the three-judge panel, for which nobody's really complained. And secondly, it is a modest adjustment in that it gives incentives after serving a full term in people that can demonstrate they're ready to go back into society. Doesn't mean they will. Siran is eligible for parole, but he's not getting out. He was denied just this last week. The same of other people. What you want to do is provide the incentives for real transformation. You
mentioned the 10 Commandments earlier, and of course you have Jesuit training. And I'm wondering how your religious faith, your religious teachings, thoughtfulness about religion and justice, how has that affected the way you think about all these things?
Well, I certainly have been brought up with the idea of forgiveness and redemption. The essence of Christianity is redemption. That's Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. That's what it's all about. So those who say, once you commit certain crimes, you are forever, for 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, 80 years, that's it. That really does run afoul of not only Christianity, but our whole American tradition, and just plain common sense. Because the proposition of the DAs is, we know on the day we charge, or on the day of the judge sentences, everything that can occur, we know all we need to know for the next 50 years. And all I'm saying is, you might have had some very good ideas there in the charges and the verdict that came in. But over the passage of time, men change, women change. And those changes ought to be accommodated so that we can open up the cells for new people that are even more dangerous.
Redemption is an idea that you've just mentioned, and I'm wondering if you say that signing the law was a mistake. And I'm wondering if now this is a kind of redemption you're seeking for yourself, to try to fix something, fix a mistake.
You know, when I look at it, I think the mistake in the determinate sentencing is that it takes away all incentive for a man to take charge of his life. Even though now I see the determinate sentencing as having real infirmities. That law, if they left it there, would have been very different than the law we have. The law we have literally has been encumbered with thousands and thousands of new legal prescriptions and rules. And that has made it not only unfair, it's made it unworkable, it's made it a danger to public safety, and it's made it extremely hard to administer. You
were governor 35 years ago, and you have an unusual opportunity to look back now, including at this law that you signed in 1976. What is that like to be able to look back and at you as a young man signing these laws? We live in a different time now.
So I would say this, that we do have more wisdom. Over time, well, the world changes, and we have to adapt, and we have to learn from the past how to make our present better. And I can say this, law tends to get complicated. Law is getting more prescriptive.
And then last question, what's your take on the presidential election?
I think the turbulence, the polarization, the completely discordant views, unfortunately are reflective of the American society today. There's a great deal of concern, even fear, even anger, and that's being expressed by the political leaders who are trying to seek the presidency.
Any regrets you're not running?
Not really, but I think about it.
Just a little.
Just a little.
Governor Brown, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.